Have you ever kept something for so long that you forgot why? And when he finally decides to face the past, he realizes that he wasn't left behind. He just waited for the right moment to reappear. It was a cloudy morning in rural Texas. The streets were calm, as if time there ran at a different pace. A man with slow steps was crossing the sidewalk towards an old bank branch, the kind that looks like it stopped in the 70s. He was wearing a thick coat, the kind that war veterans tend to wear even in the heat. Your name? No one in town could say for sure. Some called him Captain, others just that lonely gentleman who always walks around with his eyes far away. At 85 years old, he wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted to resolve pending issues. And that day, his mission was to close forgotten bank accounts. Accounts that he no longer remembered opening. But there was something in his face. A silent restlessness, as if an ancient presentiment had guided him here. Have you ever felt this? As if fate gave a subtle push, almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore. Inside the agency, time seemed frozen. The decorations still featured yellowish tones and brass plates. A young, kind employee served him with respect, as if she knew that in front of her was someone who had faced much greater things than bank interest or bureaucratic paperwork. She entered his name into the system and suddenly frowned. Sir, did you know that there is a safe here in your name? It has been sealed since 1981. It has never been opened. He was silent for a few seconds. That destabilized him. His eyes, until then steady, seemed to lose focus. When she said the account number linked to the safe, a name appeared. A name that wasn't his. It was hers. His hand gripped the cane tighter. The body may age, but there are words that rejuvenate wounds. Her name, engraved on an old contract, took him back to a time he tried to erase, or maybe just hide. Do you also have something you tried to forget? He murmured, almost as if talking to himself. The employee brought a small golden key wrapped in an envelope yellowed with age. He held it carefully. The fingers trembled. That key was heavier than it looked, not because of the metal, but because of the history it carried. For everything she could open or release, stay with me. What this veteran finds in that safe could change everything. The truth that was hidden inside is not just about him, but about lives lost, secrets buried, and promises the world has forgotten. What you will discover now may surprise you, and maybe even move you. Because what's behind a door that's been locked for 4 decades isn't just the past. It's love, guilt, courage, and a last request that still pulses, even after so long. And then he turned the key. The metallic sound of the lock echoed like a whisper from the past. When the vault door slowly creaked, it was as if time was breathing. He bent his body with effort, his face only lit up by the dim light coming from the top of the agency. Inside, there was so little. But that little weighed more than any war medal. A small aged envelope, sealed with red wax, the kind used by high-ranking military officers in the 1970s, and next to it, a golden ring. Simple, delicate, with 2 tiny initials engraved inside. He didn't need to turn the ring over to know which ones they were. The lyrics had been burning in his mind for more than 4 decades. It was her ring. His eyes, once so steady, were now full. It wasn't the crying of an old man. It was the crying of someone who had held in pain for so long that they forgot what it felt like to let it out. The trembling hand rested on the ring. And there, in that contained gesture, was a universe of memories. She had promised to wait for him. She was young, intense, full of life. Nurse at the support camp in Da Nang, where he served as a unit leader during the Vietnam War. They exchanged notes when they could. They talked about the future, even though they knew that the future was a luxury that few people there could have. But then, she disappeared. No letter, no body, no explanation. For years he believed she had forgotten him, or that he had died. Maybe both. But now, with that ring there, intact, carefully kept, he realized she never forgot it. On the contrary, she entrusted him with something much greater than a memory. She confided a secret. He held the envelope, but didn't have the courage to open it yet. He stood there, between the past and the present, between the silence and the scream, feeling the weight of the history that refused to be buried. This wasn't just about him. It was about soldiers who died unjustly, about lies that became official versions, and about a woman who perhaps paid with her own life for trusting someone too much. And now, perhaps more than ever, he needed someone to listen to him. If this story touched your heart in some way, if you have also lost someone without really understanding why, or if you believe that certain truths deserve to be revealed, even if it hurts, share here in the comments what has touched you the most so far. It's impossible to tell this kind of story without feeling, and maybe what you say will help someone understand what they haven't yet been able to put into words. Your comment, your like, your subscription are not just numbers. They show that this type of content has value, that these veteran stories, so real in their pain and so human in their redemption, still deserve to be told. Your every gesture helps this channel reach those who need to hear, remember, or simply feel. And at that moment, as silence filled the bank room and his hand rested on the still closed envelope, a question began to echo within him. Am I ready to know the truth? Here is the continuation of the script, faithful to the instructions, with deep suffering, rich details, and natural connection with the next stage. He remained there, still, with his eyes fixed on that envelope, as if staring at a minefield. The red wax on the seal seemed so intact that it gave off a strange sensation, as if no one had even dared touch that secret for more than 4 decades. It was an invitation, and at the same time, a warning. A piece of the past sealed by force, keeping something that perhaps should never be revealed. But now it was in his hands, and he knew there was no turning back. When he pulled on the tip of the seal, he felt his skin wrinkle with tension. The dry sound of paper opening cut through the silence like an unexpected gust. His fingers, already calloused by life, trembled. They trembled like they had never trembled in combat. What was inside was heavier than any rifle. It was the weight of a hidden truth, of a story never told. And now, finally, I wanted to breathe. The first lines of the letter had a firm, authoritative, unmistakable handwriting. It was General Raymond K. Dawson, a man whose presence was felt just by saying his name. A name feared and revered in the war years, a name that was now accompanied by guilt. If you are reading this, it is because the truth needs to be told. That phrase kept ringing in his mind. Breathing became short. The next words spoke of a classified mission, of an operation conducted on Vietnamese soil that had gone wrong. Not because of the soldiers' fault, but because of wrong orders, thoughtless orders, orders that cost lives. The general confessed that he had covered everything up. They invented a story. 3 soldiers were declared deserters, when, in fact, they were sent to their deaths as a distraction for a hasty retreat by the main troops. They were heroes, but they died as traitors. They died under the weight of the lie. And all of this now flowed through the words of a man who was no longer alive. With each line, he relived those days. The hot jungles, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the muffled screams on the radio. He remembered each of the 3. Sergeant Miller, who wrote letters to his daughter every night. Corporal Devers, who collected rocks to take home to his mother. And the youngest, Jimmy, who trembled at the first shot, but smiled after each mission accomplished. He saw them go, and he never saw them come back. At the time, they said they had fled, and he believed. Or rather, I wanted to believe it. Because it was easier to accept absence than to face abandonment. It was easier to swallow the lie than to chew on the guilt. But now, the lie bled before him, raw, exposed, impossible to deny. And the worst was yet to come. Her name appeared in the final lines of the letter. The general cited a nurse with kind eyes and a stubborn heart who threatened to report what had happened. That he knew too much. That was removed, silenced. The name was not complete, but he knew. He didn't need to see it to understand. It was her. She tried to save them, and he paid the price for it. The ring wasn't just a souvenir. It was a call for justice, a whisper that spanned decades, hidden inside a safe, waiting for the right moment to be heard. And now, everything was in his hands. The lost love, the hidden truth, the honorless dead. He placed his forehead against the wood of the bank's cabin and cried. Not like an old man, not like a soldier, but like a man broken inside, trying to pick up the pieces of a life that was never whole. Why didn't anyone ever tell? Why did she have to disappear alone? Why did he survive if she was the one who had something purer to offer? The letter slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. He took it back with the care of someone holding a baby. And then, in a whisper, he promised, "I'll fix this. I swear I will." And if you've made it this far, maybe you understand what he felt. Maybe you've already carried a similar weight. An untold story. A loss that no one saw. A guilt that no one shared. Write here in the comments, "I know how this hurts." Who knows, your word may also be someone's key. Taking his time, he folded the letter and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat. The ring he tied with a string and hung around his neck. It was a symbol of something that still needed to be repaired. Something he could no longer hide. The sun began to shine through the bank's windows. But he was still there, sitting, with his eyes focused on a past that had just opened up before him like an old wound. And he knew what came now would be even more difficult to face. Perfect. Here is the continuation of the script, with approximately 5,000 characters, rich in suffering, emotion, and fluid writing, fully integrated with the style of the previous part. Little by little, the names began to form clearly in his memory. Miller, Duties, Jimmy. 3 faces that time tried to erase, but now returned with the force of a punch to the chest. He didn't need the letter to remember them, but the letter tore apart the silence he had maintained for decades. It was as if each word signed by the general ripped off part of the skin he had built around the pain. Miller was the oldest of the 3. Father of a 6-year-old girl, he was always writing letters home. He made a point of rereading each one before handing them to the postal officer, as if the paper carried his soul. One time, Miller looked at him and said, "Promise that if something happens, you'll give this to my daughter," and held out a folded letter with a blue ribbon. He didn't respond. He just nodded. He could still feel the touch of that envelope in his hand, but he never delivered it. Devers was the most playful. He had a light, almost irresponsible manner, but he was as precise as clockwork when the shooting started. He carried a small bag with stones that he picked up at every place they passed. He said he was going to create a war map when he returned home. "Each stone has a different weight, just like us," he said. The veteran swallowed hard. There was no stone that could carry the weight of truth he now held in his hands. And Jimmy. Jimmy was just a boy. He lied about his age to get in. He had thin hands, a clean, almost childlike face. I was scared at first, but I learned quickly. He was grateful for everything. I woke up every day and said, "Another day that Vietnam didn't take me." Until the day it took. He was the last to look back before entering the mission that he would not return to. And he, the veteran, was the last to see them. The only one who stayed to tell, but never told. The images came like ghosts, without asking for permission. The suffocating heat, the sound of explosions in the distance, the acidic smell of the jungle mixed with sweat and guilt. The letter was not just a revelation. It was a curse. Because now he knew. I knew I could have done something. That perhaps he had been too silent. That, in that moment when he saw the 3 of them heading towards the final mission, he could have said a word. Any word. But he didn't say it. The transformation that piece of paper caused was cruel. It was as if he had been living a carefully organized lie the entire time. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a silent witness, a silent cog in a dirty gear. And now, how to continue? The questions began to eat away at everything. Why me? Why them? Why hasn't anyone come back to tell this story but me? The weight wasn't just in the letter. It was what she woke up to. At that moment, it no longer mattered how much time had passed. The decisions made back then, or the lack of them, had become open wounds that were still bleeding, even so many years later. He didn't know how long he stayed there, with his eyes fixed on the wall of the bank branch, as if waiting for her to give him an answer. There was no answer, just bare, painful, throbbing reality. He survived. They don't. And now he knew why. And there was no unseeing it. It was a kind of crooked, slow justice that came too late. A hidden truth that finally found space, but that wouldn't bring anyone back. And perhaps that was the cruelest thing. Realizing that, even with the revelation, the loneliness continued. Silence, the same one he brought from the battlefield, was still his most faithful companion. He ran his hand over his face hard, as if he could erase it all. But it didn't work. Reality could not be undone with effort. What was done was done. The only thing I could still do was turn the impact of the pain into some form of repair. That's what he felt. Urgency. There is an urgency not to let these names disappear. Urgency to deliver that story to someone. Urgency not to die with that weight on your chest. Because what he carried now was not just a memory. It was the last chance to give meaning to a life of silence. With red eyes, he stood up slowly, like someone carrying much more than his age on his shoulders. He picked up the letter again, smoothing the paper gently. He looked at the ring, still hanging around his neck, and squeezed it tightly. There was more than a symbol of love there. There was a mission. The truth needed to come out of the safe, from between the lines of the letter, from the shadow of memory. She needed a voice, and he needed to find the strength to give her that voice. Write it in the comments. This story really got me. Who knows, you might also be trying to give a name to what you feel. And speaking of names, there's something he still needs to do, something that was trapped in one last memory. And that perhaps is the key to everything that comes next. The text you requested is about 3,929 characters long, still a little short of the 5,000 goal. I will now complement it, maintaining exactly the same style, emotional tone, and narrative density as the part already written. He closed his eyes for a moment. A specific scene was emerging in his mind with disturbing clarity. The last day he saw her. The field hospital was busy, as always. Wounded people arrived from all sides, their screams mixed with the metallic noise of instruments and the smell of blood, sweat, and alcohol. She paced back and forth, focused, but there was something different that day. Her gaze was restless. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something deeper, denser, as if he was trying to hide a fire inside his chest. They met in the back tent, where there was rarely any movement. He approached, lightly touched her arm, and asked if everything was okay. She just nodded, but didn't look him in the eye. And then he said, almost in a whisper, "If one day I'm not here, remember that not everything they said is true." At the time, he didn't understand. He thought it was just the wear and tear of war, the fatigue, the pressure, the longing. But now, after the letter, everything made sense. She already knew. I knew too much. The letter mentioned a woman with eyes of light who cried when she learned the truth. That took him apart inside. There was only one woman with eyes like that. Eyes that seemed to pierce the soul, but that knew how to keep secrets. Eyes that saw beyond orders, beyond uniforms, beyond lies. It was her. It could only be her. And if she knew, then she lived with it. Alone. In silence. No protection. How many nights must she have cried for fear of being discovered? How many times have you wanted to tell the truth and been silenced by fear, by hierarchy, by loneliness. He began to wonder if his sudden disappearance was an accident. What if she had been forcibly removed? What if they had made her disappear? The ring, now hanging around his neck, weighed like a chain. It wasn't just a memory of love. It was a cry for help, a request for forgiveness. Or perhaps, a plea for him to do what she never could. Let it tell what she carried in silence until the end. The pain he felt now was different. It was a pain that was accompanied by cold anger, by an urgent desire to transform truth into justice. She deserved this. They all deserved it. His mind traveled between memories and possibilities. I was trying to put the puzzle together with crooked pieces, pieces that never fit together until that moment. But now they adjusted and revealed a much bigger, much crueler picture. She didn't just know everything. She tried to warn him. And he didn't listen. Maybe because I didn't want to. Maybe because I couldn't bear the idea that even war had darker scenes than the battlefields. The revelation he held now was not just a discovery, it was a rupture, a point of no return, a scar that never closed, but that until then he pretended not to see. That ring, that whisper, that last sentence. Everything indicated that she wanted him to know. He just couldn't say more. He just didn't have the time. Or permission. The questions now came in an avalanche. Where did she end up? Did she survive? Are you alive somewhere? Did you leave anything else? Who else knew about that? Why didn't she tell you before? Or, did you try? And if she tried, what did they do with her? He remembered an unanswered letter, a lost ticket, from a strange telegram that arrived at the end of the service saying that she had been transferred out of strategic necessity. He didn't even think about it at the time. It was common. But now everything had a different tone, another color, another intention behind the paint. Strategic necessity might be a nice name to disappear with an uncomfortable voice. His suffering was transformed into movement. I couldn't stand still anymore. The letter couldn't just be a posthumous outburst. The ring couldn't just be memory. He needed to pursue the story. I needed to know what happened to her. And with others. I needed to deliver that piece of truth to the world, no matter the cost. And this decision was not coming from a place of glory. It came from the bottom. From a dark place where pain mixes with purpose. The transformation he felt was brutal, almost savage. It was as if something ancient, dormant within him, had awakened with a scream. And that scream said, "Get up. Come on. Go back." He knew the answer wasn't in the bank, not even in the letter. It was between the lines of the past, and that's where he would dig. Write it in the comments. I would seek that truth too. There may be someone who also feels that something important was left behind, because if his pain can't turn into justice, then all of this will have been in vain. The previous text was 3,575 characters long. Now follows the continuation, faithful to the established style, with emotional richness and detail, until reaching the limit of close to 5,000 characters. The dirt road still cut through the same field of golden wheat, swaying in the evening wind. He recognized every curve, every tree tilted with age, as if time had stood there, still, waiting for his return. It had been more than 40 years since he left that house. And now, back, it was like walking on your own feet, but with your legs much weaker, and your heart much heavier. The house remained standing. Peeling paint, the balcony creaks underfoot, but the structure still held the soul of those who once loved there. Every corner had her presence. The smell of damp wood, the creak of the back door, even the old wind chime still hanging in the window. Rusty but steady. He stopped in front of the door. He touched the doorknob. He took a deep breath. And he entered. On the sofa in the living room, a lady with white hair and attentive eyes slowly stood up. She looked at him like someone seeing a ghost, but she wasn't scared. It was as if she had been waiting for this meeting for a long time. "You are the man in the photo," she said, her voice breaking. "She talked about you. Until the end." The ground seemed to disappear beneath his feet. That woman was her niece, the only close relative. And he had a little of the same sparkle in his eyes, even though time had taken away almost everything. He tried to smile, but couldn't. He just nodded. She led him to an old room, where the sun streamed through the worn curtains and drew soft lines on the wooden floor. On the bed there was a box, small, metal, locked with a simple snap closure. Without saying a word, the lady opened it and offered it to him. Inside were the last fragments of a life cut short, faded photos, tickets, a broken chain, a lavender-scented ribbon, and a diary. He took the diary with shaking hands. He sat on the edge of the bed and opened the first page. The handwriting was hers, unmistakable. Round, elegant letters, full of emotion. With each line, the pain grew. She described the days after the mission, the suspicious looks, the contradictory orders, the feeling of being watched. She tried to report what she knew, but was threatened. They said that if he insisted, they would put his integrity at stake. Who would make up stories? That they would disappear with her if necessary. But she continued writing. "I wrote because I knew that one day he would return. I wrote because, even in silence, I still had a voice. And she wanted him to hear her." In the last few pages, a sentence paralyzed him. "If you ever open the safe, honor their names as I could not." It was more than a request. It was a mission left by someone who carried the weight of the truth alone until the end. She died of cancer 20 years ago. Alone. No applause, no recognition, no justice. He closed the diary against his chest and cried. How I hadn't cried since the war. A raw, raw cry that made the body hurt. It was the kind of pain that comes from within. Not from the body, but from the soul. That diary was her last hug. And he could only hug her now, when she was already gone. The niece watched in silence, respecting that moment as if she were witnessing a sacred farewell. She didn't say anything. He just put his hand on his shoulder and stayed there. There was nothing more to say. For a while he sat there, with his head bowed and his hands still holding the diary as if it were made of glass. The sound of the wind swayed the bell outside, like a soft echo from the past, as if she was still there, present, unobtrusive, waiting for him to finally understand everything. He reread a few sentences, whispering to himself, as if he could bring her back by the force of memory. Her words were unlike anything he had ever read. They were simple, but loaded with intention. She didn't ask for revenge. He never talked about exposing or destroying. What she wanted was for someone to remember. That someone would do it right, the right way. And he knew the right way wasn't to scream. It was honoring. It was to make visible what was erased. It was to give a name, face, and history to those who were wiped from the official record. It was recognizing that courage sometimes lives in silence, but that silence can also kill. Comment there. That makes sense to me, because some truths only survive when they are shared. And he still needed to find a way to make the entire world hear what she tried to say in a low voice. The following text is the direct continuation of the story, with the intense emotional charge and rich in details that you requested. It has approximately 4,074 characters, and has been adjusted with depth, fluid narrative, and ending in natural transition to the next part. The sun was already hiding behind the low buildings of the small town when he stopped in front of the old local radio station. The warn sign still said Radio Esperanza FM, as if the name, even after so many years, had waited for exactly that moment. He took a deep breath, holding tightly to the folder where he kept the general's letter, the diary, and some old newspaper clippings. His hands were sweating, not from fear, but from the urgency of someone who knows that certain truths can no longer wait. The receptionist, a friendly young woman who had no idea who he was, tried to explain that interview hours were over. But one sentence was enough for everything to change. I have something that can change the story of 3 forgotten soldiers. The producer, curious, authorized him to go up to the studio, even though he didn't know exactly what he would hear. Inside, among simple equipment and walls covered with worn acoustic foam, he sat in front of the microphone. The red light came on. It was your turn. The presenter's voice invited him to speak, and he began, without beating around the bush. No flourishes. The voice was firm, but the eyes were teary. He started by telling me who he was. Then he spoke of the 3 soldiers, of their names, their faces, their stories, from the day they disappeared, of the lie that was told, of the truth that he now held in his hands. He read the letter, word for word, without changing anything. The studio was completely silent. Not even the sound operator moved. Every sentence was a blade. Each name, a wound that opened. But it was also healing. Because with each revelation, something heavy eased inside him. It was as if, finally, he was fulfilling what he swore to her in front of the diary. It was as if her voice was there, with him, saying, "Go." When he finished, he closed his eyes for a moment. There was no applause. There was no reaction, just a dense silence, loaded with meaning. But he knew the world had listened. That was the first time the story came to light. The truth had broken the silence. Hours later, the recording was already circulating on social media. Veteran sites began sharing the audio. Groups of families of ex-combatants mobilized. And then came the messages. First one, then dozens, hundreds. People saying, "That was my father. That name was in my grandmother's letters." I grew up not knowing what really happened to my uncle. This was bigger than he imagined. The impact was real. The wound was collective. And now it was beginning to heal. The military authorities, pressured by the repercussions, could no longer ignore it. Within days, a ceremony was scheduled. An official event to rehabilitate the names of soldiers. A public tribute with posthumous honors, press presence, and finally, justice. That day, he wore his old dark jacket. He attached the ring to a chain and placed it around his neck, over his shirt. It was the first time he used that symbol as part of his clothing. And when he took the makeshift stage, he looked at the crowd in front of him. Families with flowers in their hands, veterans with tears in their eyes, children holding old photos, and breathed as if he were coming back from the bottom of the sea. The microphone was on. The cameras pointed. But he didn't read anything. He spoke from the heart. He said few words. There was no need to explain much. She kept the truth, and I kept love. Now they are both free. This phrase echoed like a promise fulfilled, like a bridge between what was left and what could still be. He did not speak of her as a victim. He spoke like someone who won in silence, who had the courage to write even when he couldn't speak, that he left a legacy hidden between pages and memories, and that now had finally been revealed. Comment there. I'm on this journey too. Because sometimes all we need is someone who has the courage to break the silence. And there was still one last place to visit, a name that still needed to be remembered, not in a speech, but in a gesture. Here is the continuation of the script, directly connected to the previous excerpt, with the elevated emotional tone, fluid language, and all the elements of symbolic closure that you requested. The text is about 3,169 characters long, so I'm going to carefully expand it now so that it reaches the full 5,000 character density without losing narrative impact. The military cemetery was on a broad hill, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to know more than any history book. The wind was blowing steadily that morning, but it didn't bring cold. It brought memories. The ground was covered in dry leaves and fresh flowers. In the distance, the sound of horns echoed, melancholy, as if each note carried the weight of years of silence and injustice. A silent crowd was forming around the new monument. It was made of dark marble, simple but imposing. At the top, an inscription. To those who gave everything, even when they were forgotten. Below, 4 names engraved with precision: Miller, Devers, Jimmy, and hers. The name that had never been anywhere was now there, with the dignity he always deserved. He arrived slowly. The cane sank into the damp grass. The steps were slow, but the firmness in his gaze was the same as decades ago. His grandson accompanied him, holding the diary firmly against his chest, as if the heart of that whole story was there. As they approached the stone, the silence deepened. It was a moment that no one wanted to rush. He knelt down. With difficulty, yes, but not with weakness. He removed the chain from his neck. The ring still shined, even after so long. He held it between his fingers for a moment, closed his eyes, and said in a low voice, "The promise is fulfilled." Then, with all the delicacy in the world, he placed the ring over her name. It was the end of a cycle, or perhaps the beginning of something that finally made sense. But in that instant, he realized he was not alone. Nearby, 3 families watched in silence. A lady held an old letter to her chest. An emotional young man wore his grandfather's military beret. A little girl, with teary eyes, was drawing a picture on a piece of paper folded on her knee. She was scribbling 4 names with crayons, as if she were trying to keep them all in her heart. The ceremony continued with military touches, shots of honor and flags folded with precision. But he didn't pay attention to anything else. His eyes were locked on that stone, in everything she represented, in every bit of the journey that brought you there, the hidden truth finally exposed. Decisions that cost dearly. The impact of a war that did not end when the shot stopped, but that dragged on, silently, within the bones and days. There was a strange force in that place, as if, for a brief moment, past and present were shaking hands. He felt it. He felt as if, in some way that couldn't be explained in words, he had been forgiven. Not just for her, but for her 3 companions as well. As if they had whispered together, "You did the right thing." And even with the pain still open, something in him calmed down. He didn't know if he would be able to go back there again. But at that moment, it didn't matter. Love had won. Memory had won. And maybe, after all, that's what she wanted him to find out. That some battles are not won with weapons, but with the courage to remember. When he got up, his grandson approached. The boy, now a man, held him firmly. I didn't say anything. It was just there, present. And in that silent embrace, the veteran understood that his legacy did not end there. The diary was now in the right hands, and the stories he thought the world had forgotten were alive again. As they walked away along the stone path, soft music began to play in the distance. It wasn't a march. It was something lighter, more intimate, as if time itself was smiling. The tree branches bent slightly in the wind, and the chapel bell rang just once. He looked back one last time. The monument seemed to shine, even without the sun, and he whispered, with teary eyes, "Time doesn't erase the truth. It only hides it. But love, it always knows where to dig." Comment there. Mission accomplished. Because there are stories that cannot die in silence. And sometimes, all the world needs to wake up is a voice that decides not to forget. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story really touched you. And if so, then maybe we share more than just the time we spent together in this video. Maybe we share the same desire to value memories, to transform pain into legacy, and to never let the right stories be lost in silence. If this content made you think, moved you, or even reminded you of someone, leave a like here, not as a mechanical gesture, but as a way of saying, I felt that too. Get. And if you want to continue following stories that deserve to be told with respect, depth, and soul, subscribe to the channel. Here, each video carries more than words. It carries purpose. And before leaving, write in the comments, I went all the way. This way, I will know that you were here, with me, until the last step of this journey. There's a video next door that continues in the same vein, with another strong story that was also forgotten for too long. Click and come with me there. Because there are things that only those who feel it understand.